Je vais prier Madame Carolina Sepulveda d'afficher la prochaine. C'est Monsieur Damase Hebert qui va nous présenter un aperçu de l'application des normes du NPCC. Damase, c'est à vous.
Bonjour, good morning, everyone. It's still the morning. My name is Damase Hebert. I am Associate General Counsel and Director of Enforcement at NPCC. Joining me for this presentation is Aaron Hornick, Senior Compliance Mitigation Analyst, and Mina Ellis, Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Analyst. We're going to be providing an enforcement overview, describe how to conduct a risk assessment, and present some enforcement metrics. Next slide, please. So this next slide is a very brief description of the enforcement overview. For every non-compliance, regardless of the discovery method, NPCC works with the entity to understand what happened by understanding the facts and circumstances of the non-compliance. The facts and the circumstances of each non-compliance are always different, and the entity is always in the best position to know exactly what happened and when it happened. The entity knows the staff, the organizational or the reporting structure, the corporate culture, and the facilities and the assets better than NPCC does. Keep that in mind when you are submitting a self-report or answering questions based on a request for information from NPCC. Some things that are obvious to the person filling out the self-report form or answering the request for information may not be obvious to NPCC or anybody else that's not at that entity. Therefore, it is always best to be as specific and detailed as possible. Make sure you described what happened, why it happened, where it happened, and how it happened. NPCC works with the entity. The next bullet is NPCC works with the entity to conduct an independent risk assessment of the non-compliance or a group of non-compliance. Aaron and Mina will go into detail on the risk assessment. Finally, NPCC reviews the mitigation for the non-compliance to help sure that the mitigation corrects the non-compliance and prevents it from recurring again. This means that there should be at least one activity that corrects or remediates the non-compliance to restore compliance as timely as possible. In other words, if maintenance, testing, patching, documenting, or some other activity wasn't performed, the entity needs to perform it to get back into compliance. Additionally, there should be at least one activity, which is almost always a separate activity, to prevent or reduce the likelihood of recurrence of the non-compliance. This activity should address the cause or the root cause of the violation and may be a procedural or a technical control. Depending on the facts and circumstances of the non-compliance, this can be as simple as a calendar program or reminder, but it can also be checklists, new or amended processes or procedures, or new databases. In certain cases, and especially for serious violations or systemic issues, it may require major updates to a compliance program, even the creation of new departments, or the creation or purchase of new tools. Next slide, please. So this slide just presents some basic questions that NPCC will need answering for every non-compliance. How was the non-compliance discovered? Was it identified due to an internal control or an internal reporting system at the entity? Or was it just identified by happenstance because an audit was coming? When exactly did the non-compliance start and end? Just when did it start and when did it end, and provide some descriptions for that. What is the root cause of the non-compliance? If there is human error involved, what allowed that human error to result in the non-compliance? What controls are in place? And again, what steps did the entity take to correct the noncompliance and to prevent it from recurring again? All of this information should be included in the self-report, and all of this information is necessary for NPCC to process a noncompliance. At this point, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Mina Ellis to discuss risk determinations. Go ahead, Mina.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Mina Ellis. I'm a compliance analyst at NPCC. I'm going to start off the discussion on risk, and then I'll hand it off to Aaron Hornick to continue. So, on next slide. Great. How is risk determined? The ERO, which was mentioned earlier, means the Electric Reliability Organization. The ERO framework for determining risk is the likelihood of the risk occurring and the severity of its impact. As a region and part of the ERO enterprise, that is what NPCC is doing, analyzing the likelihood or probability of risk occurring and the level of impact to determine whether that risk is low, medium, or high. Enforcement at NPCC assesses risk in order to determine the disposition track of a noncompliance. That means for a Canadian province, such as Quebec, whether a noncompliance is disposed of as an SICM, so as a SICM, processed under a simplified procedure, because our final determination with the Régie's approval is that the noncompliance is of a lower risk, or whether it's an elevated disposition because of a higher risk. The following slides will discuss factors of a risk assessment. Thanks. One of the factors of the risk assessment is the standard and requirement that's at issue. So located within the standard and requirement, there's information to consider that's there to use in identifying risk. Some standards have a very straightforward risk associated. SIP 004 noncompliances around failing to complete personal risk assessments or around revoking access tend to be straightforward. You know, if a personal risk assessment was not completed, how long did it go on? If access was not revoked within 24 hours, how long was inappropriate access retained? But, you know, other standards like SIP 002, for example, if you're failing to categorize assets, then it's possible that you are not providing other SIP protections. And that type of issue could result in more associated risk or even additional noncompliances. Some standards also have a unique and serious risk associated. For example, noncompliance with FAC 003 could result in vegetation-related transmission outages. So if there was a sustained outage caused by vegetation contact, it's not a question of whether or not there was a management failure. There was a management failure, and that's an elevated risk. A discussion would occur on the rationale for that type of failure, meaning, you know, how severe was the failure to manage vegetation? As an entity, did you find this unusual condition in an otherwise sound vegetation management program? Or is it that somehow you missed vegetation changes that would have been, you know, should have been caught during a routine inspection and an outage occurred? So likely vegetation growth or encroachment was not being adequately addressed by the program you have in place. Next slide. Thank you. Another factor of a risk assessment are the facts and circumstances. What is the narrative? What is it that happened? Those first two bulleted questions, if affirmative, will more than likely mean a higher risk. So let me read them out. Was the noncompliance intentional or a result of negligence? Was the failure part of a wide systemic issue? Answering yes to either of those implies a problematic or non-existent culture of compliance, and that would definitely influence the risk determination. The third bulleted question there, if affirmative, can mean a lower risk. For example, evidence confirms an entity properly protecting an asset, but only missing certain documentation to that effect. Another question on circumstances that matters here is how was the issue discovered? Was it self-reported or was it found through an audit? Also, if there are any unique circumstances, we want to know. So make sure that information is included because it could affect the risk assessment. Here's another example. If you're a generation owner whose transmission planner has given you a form to complete, to populate that form with data verifying the real power capability of your applicable facilities. You complete that form, you get it back to your transmission planner as required, and you believe you're compliant. But here is the unique circumstance. The MOD 025 standard for R1 requires more data than what's included on the transmission planner's form. all the data that you need to give according to the standard and requirement is actually not on the form. So based on what you've provided, even though your transmission planner only needs and has only asked for certain data, as an entity, you found yourself in non-compliance with Mod 025R1. We would want to know that the reason you only provided certain modeling data is because the transmission planner only requested certain data. Next slide, please. Two other factors in assessing risk are the assets affected and duration. Questions we ask as enforcement are, how many assets were affected? Is it a handful, or are we talking hundreds? It's easy when there's a big difference, but it's not always so cut and dry, not always so clear. And what did those assets control? We also look at the duration. Did the noncompliance last for a few days, or was it occurring for months or even years? If the issue is discovered quickly, that would help reduce the risk, but ongoing for years would likely increase the risk. Think of a SIP 005, which concerns electronic security perimeters. A SIP 005 issue lingering for years would most assuredly raise the risk. But what about if it's a poorly documented visitor control program? Are there missing details for someone who visited in January and again, missing details for another person in June of that year? So, okay, technically the duration might be 6 months, but if each of those visitors was only there for a day, there's 2 days really where the entity was specifically non-compliant. And, that specificity is important and we want to know about it. That's what we discuss when considering duration of a non-compliance and assessing risk. I'm going to pass it on to Aaron with the next slide.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mina. I'll also be speaking to some of our slides on assessing risk, and I'm going to pick up where Mina left off so we can just jump right in. So another aspect that we consider is the harm or the impact from the non-compliance. If it's a SIP issue, what was the impact rating of the assets involved? You've got your high, medium, and low impact assets. So you want to make sure your assets are categorized correctly, and each level brings with it a certain amount of risk. We also consider what actually occurred, right? Did any harm occur? Are we late for a test, or did a whole substation go down? What could have happened, right? Could this non-compliance have led to greater losses or made it far more likely that someone would be able to exploit a vulnerability? These are all the building blocks of that risk assessment. Can we go to the next slide? So the mitigating factors are another key aspect of the risk determination. When we're thinking about mitigating factors, we're asking what kind of protections are in place during the period of non-compliance that could offset the risk. What kind of systems or controls or processes did the entity have in place that reduce the likelihood of impact? So one example of mitigating factors would be a SIP 6 non-compliant. Right? Think of an escorted visitor at a facility who gets left alone for a few minutes, or someone who was inside a physical security perimeter leaves with the escort and then gets back in. Maybe someone holds a door. We see those types of issues reported, right? So either of these would be a non-compliance. But then the next question for us is what could have happened? What could this person do now if they're alone? For one already inside, could they just sit down at a terminal, they log in? Probably not, right? There's probably need to put in a username, password, login somehow, right? That would qualify as a control. If the visitor had malicious motives and wanted to use a USB stick with malware, hopefully there are protections against that sort of thing, maybe a USB blocker or antivirus software or intrusion detection system that might be able to flag that with an alarm of some kind, or right. These would all be examples of mitigating factors or controls. Maybe there's a camera set up, so security personnel could flag that someone's inside who shouldn't be, or is unescorted. Another mitigating factor. And of course, where was the visitor? What kind of access did they have? Right? Were they stuck in a hallway, or were they loose in a server room? Right. So some of these details may seem obvious to you if you're reporting your non-compliance. Right. Obviously, we have passwords on the computers. Okay, but how were right? Obviously, you've got the passwords on the computers, but we know there's a non-compliance. We need all these additional details. to know how much impact a particular noncompliance could result in. So we want to understand all the context to make that good risk determination. And we need those details for our report. We can't just assume those protections are there. So we would encourage you all to include as many protections as possible when you're writing that stuff out, because those protections may offset the risk. Slide. Okay, so let's talk about prior compliance history. Does the entity have prior violations of the noncompliance, right? How were those prior noncompliances disposed? Minimal risk compliance exceptions are going to have significantly less of an impact on risk than those resolved at higher risk or higher disposition levels, right? But sometimes an initial issue won't be a minimal risk issue, right? If you have a vegetation contact, like Mina mentioned, that's something that NPCC is going to be paying very close attention to, right? And if you have a second one 6 months or a year later, the risk is almost assuredly going to be raised, right? Because now it's starting to look like a trend and not a good one. Now we know that not every noncompliance that repeats is the result of a systemic issue. We know some types of noncompliances can be considered high frequency conduct, but when we do see issues repeating, that's going to be flagged and it's going to play a role in risk considerations. So we consider all compliance history, but compliance exceptions are not generally considered aggravating for risk determination. Noncompliances that are moderate risk or disposed of at one of those higher disposition methods, those will have a much greater weight in any risk determination. Slide. So some entities use a risk matrix like this. So I included it because it's a good visual representation of what's happening when we make a risk determination. So what is the probability of something occurring? And what kind of impact would be the result, right? So what's the probability of something occurring? And what kind of impact would be the result? So sometimes we see a statement like this. The noncompliance was corrected quickly, so there was no potential risk. So basically, as soon as the entity realized they were non-compliant, they corrected the issue and returned to compliance. But that non-compliance may have been ongoing for a couple of days, weeks, months, even a year before being discovered. And even though it was corrected quickly after discovery, that duration carries risk. So after an entity's back in compliance, we want to start thinking about preventing recurrence. When we're thinking about risk, we're thinking about it during the period of non-compliance itself. So you may find some folks will write risk assessments from that after the fact perspective. So we're interested in the risk during the period of non-compliance itself. Slide. So in order to provide an appropriate risk assessment, NPCC still needs the same amount of detail from entities to process non-compliances that come through the newly minted align. So we still need to know whether the assets perform reliability tasks. We still want to know capacity factors. A risk assessment is going to try to balance all these competing factors. What happened? What would have happened if an attack was successful? What type of controls did the entity have to reduce the impact? And most importantly, what are the specific details relevant to this particular case, right? What was the voltage? What type of generation? What fuel type, right? What kind of cyber assets are involved? What were these cyber assets responsible for? So all these questions are getting factored in. So we need as many of these details as you can provide, so you can make a good assessment. So once you weigh all these factors, you should be able to use your professional judgment to make a final risk determination. And that's really it. That's the message we're trying to get across. And all these aspects need to be considered when determining risk. And with that, I believe I'll be handing the ball back to Damase.
Yes, next slide, please. So that was the good part of the presentation. I'm going to go through just some metrics here. I'm going to do these next 5 slides pretty quickly. I'm just going through these because entities are usually interested in what type of things NPCC is seeing from the other registered entities. So this slide right here, this just shows incoming non-compliance to NPCC through all means, meaning through self-reports, found on audits, found in self-certs, and in all NPCC jurisdictions. So it includes Quebec, but it also includes the United States, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick over the past 7 years. As you can see, 2021 has been a pretty big year. That's only data through about mid-October. So it looks like 2021 is going to be our highest year for incoming number of violations. You can also see that it's typically pretty split evenly between SIP and O&P, but this year SIP is a little bit higher than the O&P violations. Part of the message of this slide, if you have submitted a self-report and you haven't heard back from us yet, just sit tight. We're getting to process all these violations and we'll get to you. Next slide, please. This slide is Quebec specific, and we thought we would include this. This shows all income and non-compliance in Quebec through the past years. So again, this data is as of mid-October, and as you can see, there's been a lot of income and non-compliance in Quebec this year. In fact, it almost matches the last 2 years combined. Next slide, please. This one I'll go through even quicker. This shows the top violated SIP standards discovered by NPCC in the last 2 years. This includes all discovery methods and, again, all jurisdictions. As you can see, SIP 7 is by far the most violated. That's system security management, followed by SIP 4, personnel and training, and SIP 10, which is configuration change management and vulnerability assessments. Next slide. And this slide shows the top violated operations and planning standards discovered in NPCC in 2020 and 2021. Mod 25, which is real and reactive power modeling, is the most violated, followed by facility ratings, FAC 8, and protection system automatic reclosing and sudden pressure relaying, which is PRC 5. And last slide, please. Those last few slides were just to present some metrics. On behalf of myself, Aaron, and Mina, we hope this part of the workshop provided some valuable tips. We can try to answer some questions now, or if we don't have time now, there's the email address listed on that slide that you can send questions to.
OK. Je vais poser la question en anglais, ça va aller plus rapidement. You have... Okay, I'm trying to see the entire message. Just give me a second. Okay, you have just enumerated numerous elements that you need to evaluate a potential non-compliance. In the self-report form, there are the following questions. 1. Potential impact. 2. Actual impact. 3. Potential risk. 4. Actual risk. Please indicate what info you want for each of these 4 sections so that we do not uselessly repeat info throughout the form. For example, does actual impact correspond to actual harm? Is the risk sector, since impact is previously described, should one focus mainly on probability of occurrence? This is rather very specific. I don't know if you're able to answer that.
I can give it a shot. So, yeah, potential impact always is what is the worst that can happen. That's that number one. So if there are no other controls in place, we want to know what's the worst thing that can happen based on this violation. I'm sorry, that's potential risk. But no, that is potential impact. That's potential impact. Actual impact is whether anything happens. So that could be nothing, right? It could, and in most cases, we have that statement: no actual harm is known to have occurred. Actual risk and potential risk do incorporate the probability of assessment, and it also incorporates what controls that you do have in place. So if you have a violation of something, it's likely that you have other controls in place so that the worst thing that would happen hopefully wouldn't happen because of those other controls. I hope that helps.
Okay. Next question. Prochaine question. Did your compilation of non-compliance you have presented include the self non-compliance declaration or only the observed non-compliance following an audit?
No, that included both. That included self-reports and audit findings, as well as a few self-certification findings.
Okay, for the time being, there is no other question. We will wait another minute. Oh, OK, il y en a plusieurs qui sont sortis. When evaluating risk, one entity might, for example, consider a 100 megawatt loss as high, whereas another might consider it low. How can this be standardized?
So so when evaluating risk, it could be higher, it could be low, but depending on the other circumstances surrounding the violation. Was it during an event? Was it during a high risk period where the loss of 100 megawatts was a big deal, or that it was easily covered by the reliability coordinator? So it does depend. And I don't think it's really standardized, right, between entities. NPCC will conduct its independent risk assessment anyway. So we'll take a look at all the facts and circumstances and sort of make that determination.
Okay. Next question. Prochaine question. What is the breakdown of the non-compliance in Quebec, i.e., what standard?
By the standards, I don't have that off the readily available. I could say that there. I don't have that readily available. There's a mix of. It's pretty much the same standards that I showed on the slide are also pretty close to the ones that are violated in Quebec. I would say the jurisdictions are pretty even in which standards are the most violated. So you have MOD 25 in there, you have PRC 5. So it's very similar, but the exact breakdown I don't have.
Okay. Do these non-compliances include the ones related to COVID-19? If so, which standards were they related to?
These do not include the ones related to COVID-19.
Since we're running behind schedule a little bit, I would suggest that we move to the next item. Excusez, désolé. Étant donné qu'on est un petit peu en retard dans l'emploi du temps, je suggère qu'on passe à la prochaine présentation, Laurentia.
Oui, en effet. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour les présentateurs. Je vais inviter maintenant M. Scott Need pour présenter l'importance de la norme FAC 8. Merci.
Thank you, Laurentia. I hope everybody can hear me. Bonjour, my name is Scott Need with NPCC. You can kind of see my introduction slide. And I just wanted to add a few things here in addition to the FAC 008 facility ratings standard. You know, and for those that don't know, NPCC consists of the 4 Canadian provinces, Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. We have 7 United States New York, and then you have Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So that's our area there that you can see on the screen. And that's our new corporate footprint. So I really wanted to work that into the slides. Well, we got an issue here, Mike. Okay. So yes, we're on this slide right here. So if it doesn't go without saying, and I'll slow down here for the translator, you know, NPCC, we support reliability. We do some compliance work, obviously, but the root of that compliance work is reliability and security to the bulk electric system, right? So we do pre-seasonal, pre-winter and pre-summer seasonal assessments on an annual basis. We do long-term studies that look out a period of several years from a transmission adequacy and a resource adequacy perspective. We do reliability metrics on relay misoperations, loss of loads, frequency excursions, things of that nature. We do analysis of known and future risks. And I think really the big one there is this concept of what's going on now in the industry with grid transformation, right? With the distributed, especially down in the United States, distributed energy resources, with the rooftop solar, the variable energy resources with all the land wind and the ocean wind that's coming, the inverter-based resources that you heard Patrick talk about a little bit before, making sure that that energy, whether it's the wind or the sun, is available. The aggressive decarbonization goals that you have down in the northeastern United States, that's legislative, that's law, that's going to happen. So we don't even have the tools, and we don't even understand the process of how we're going to get there yet. So that's going to take some time. And then the overall increasing electrification of the grid as well, right? That means that the connected load is going to go up, and how are we going to plan for that when we have these different sources of generation that are not typically dispatchable like we've had with our thermal generation. So I wanted to add that. So, you know, we do that. We do education and outreach on that. And then the last bullet here, what we're here to talk about today is compliance activities that we do here. And we kind of heard about it here, where we do compliance monitoring, what we typically call audits, right? And then you heard from Damase, Aaron, and Mina about some of the enforcement activities that we do when we do happen to find a non-compliance. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, what should you do? An entity on this call. I just wanted to throw this in here, is that it's 2021 here. We're not trying to do, we're hoping that we're trying not to conduct check the box audits anymore, right? We're trying to have the aspiration, and hopefully the entities have the aspiration, that you folks are champions of reliabilities. Your leaders, you want to be more than just compliant, right? You want to be reliable and secure, and you want to be sustainable. You want your process and your program sustainable looking forward, right? A compliance audit looks backwards, but while we're having discussions with entities, we also want to understand their process and controls. And you heard some of these words earlier from Mina, Aaron, and Damase, of how you're going to sustain your reliability objective moving forward. So we're trying to share to people to enhance your compliance program, make sure that, you know, it's not just check the box, make sure that you have the proper personnel assigned to it. You understand that this does take work, and takes human resources, and that should be part of your corporate goals that's put in place by your senior management. So enhance your compliance program, make sure that you have an official internal compliance program, and again, that just you're not keeping track of whether you're compliant or not on a napkin. And then understand your vulnerabilities, and this is where the discussions on controls comes in, which again, Damase and Aaron and Mina mentioned a little bit. You know, implementing or adapting a culture of controls, that's really what's going to get you to that reliability objective. If you want to have a good and solid facility ratings program, which we're going to get into on the next slide here, it's not just going to happen by magic, right? A good program has good controls behind it. And with that, behind that is strong people, dedicated people, a strong understanding of your process, a commitment to process, and a structure that's put in place by your senior leadership, right? So as you're a compliance professional on this call, you're communicating upward your needs to your senior management. You're communicating with your peers to the left and right of how you're going to be compliant. And then for the folks that you happen to be implementing your program out in the field, who are getting your relay records, who are doing your facility ratings documentation, all those people, that they're a part of it and they understand as well what their role in it as well. All right, so we go to the next slide, and now we'll actually get into the facility ratings standard, and we can go to the next one here. So facility ratings, FAC 8 is what the standards is called. It's pretty important. Accurate facility ratings are the main component in the determination of accurate system operating limits for the RC, the Hydro-Quebec Control Center, to run the system in the province of Quebec, right? Without those, Without those accurate ratings, the real-time situational awareness of those operators sitting on that desk is non-existent. The planning studies are inaccurate, relay loadability settings are inaccurate, and equipment could be damaged. So the message here is that everybody plays plays a part in this, right? The large transmission owner and the generator owners who have the assets out there as well plays just as an important role. Next slide, please. So facility ratings, you mentioned, Damase mentioned it, I think, in the stats that he was going over. It's one of our more non-violent. It's more of one of our highly violated standards, and it's got a lot of eyes on it and focus at the NERC and FERC level. So we translate that over into eyes on the ball here on the prize when we deal with our Canadian partners as well. So it's been a focus for several years here with NERC. You might have heard there's a public penalty out there in April of 2021 where a USA entity had a penalty for $42 million. So the issues with Facility 8 ratings and having accurate methodologies, folks following their methodologies, and then folks having all of their series components identified, and then the proper ratings of all those series components that make up the overall rating of that particular facility. We're still getting blips out there and still seeing issues. So it's, as I said before, it plays a vital importance to real-time situational awareness modeling and planning as we look to make sure that the system is planned reliably and operated reliably. So if we can go to the next slide. I think we're doing okay on time here. So I kind of mentioned this before, focus on this by NPCC and NERC, discussions at the NERC Board of Trustees, which our Canadian regulators and friends attend those meetings as well. Facility FAC 8 is a part of the 2021 and 2022 compliance monitoring and implementation plan, not only in the US, but in Quebec as well. So that gives us, it assists us to keep the eye on the ball, so that we know it's a focus, and then the entities looking at the implementation plan know that it's important as well, and it just adds to its the role that it plays. NERC issued a practice guide there in second quarter of 2020. That's out on the NERC website. So if you're a entity on the call today and you're a generator owner or a transmission owner, that practice guide is a really good source for you to read that, and then you'll see what that does is it publicly lets the entities know what the regions in NERC are going to be looking for when we come on, when we're doing monitoring of facility FAC 8. We do outreach and workshops and newsletters. Hopefully some of the folks, you stakeholders on this meeting have know about some of that, and you're familiar with some of our information and communication and the sharing that we do from the NPCC website. And then we coordinate external as well with the North American Transmission Forum. We have FERC, we coordinate with FERC on regular semi-annual discussions there with the regional compliance staff, meeting with them so that they understand and are kept on board as a regulator down in the U.S. as long as, for example, keeping the Régie here in Quebec on board as well. All right, so if we want to go to the next slide, this is just going to be some examples of some of the issues, and I kind of already mentioned it. You know, when we're auditing and monitoring an entity's facility ratings program, these are some of the issues that we find. Some of the components are just not there. You want to make sure that you have identified all the parts and pieces that make up that overall facility. So everything from the bus through the disconnect, through the circuit breaker, out through the conductor that's actually hanging in the air, back down through the bus, the circuit breaker, and the disconnect switch on the other side in the other station. All of that all lines up, and those are all series components, right? So that's really what we want to make sure, that your methodology documents that you're going to consider and have all that stuff tracked, and then your actual documentation down in requirement 6 has all that spelled out as well, where you actually have the numbers and you actually identify what your most limiting series component is. And you can kind of see, you know, there's jumpers in the way there, there's risers inside of substations, wave traps for communications, things of that nature. So we've seen incorrect ratings, as you can imagine, on multiple types of components. Transformers that transform current for relay protections, again, jumpers and risers, the conductor that's hanging in the air, whether the stranding on a jumper in the station was an incorrect quantity, things of that nature, of all examples that we've seen and that you should be looking out for in your program. We want to go to the next slide. We'll get into the root causes a little bit. And I kind of alluded to it if you kind of read between the lines a little bit here, is that it's poor asset and configuration management and just not tracking your stuff correctly from the get-go. Perhaps your station or generating site or the capital job that enhanced your system was done on you relied on information from contractors, and maybe some of the loop on that data and looking at the prints for the project as compared to the as-built prints, and if distances were respected, and if equipment that was on the print actually got installed in the field. All of that's got to be brought back around full circle to make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and that there's not miscommunication between departments and entities. Emergency and unplanned changes in the field due to storm work and stuff, that's a really key one, where we see a lot of times the as-builts just don't quite match up, or there's a delay when something is commissioned quickly and the information doesn't flow back up to the control center in as quick a fashion as it should. So in general, speaking to this idea of internal controls and understanding your vulnerabilities and understanding what your objective is, right? Your process that you put in place to meet your objective, right? That's your means to the end, which is a solid and correct facility ratings program, right? So in general, we've seen a lack of internal controls on verification and validation and departmental handoffs between transmission design, the folks in the field actually installing the equipment and changing it out under emergency, and then getting all that information back down to engineering and then back over to the control center is really the root of what we've seen. We can go to the next slide. So these are some examples of controls, and I've kind of alluded to all these as well, as far as the field, the print matching what's out there, the print matching what's in the field. Does it match your database? And does that match what has the database back in the operation and planning models? I mentioned contractor management here. That's the third bullet there. And I think that the last one I'll just mention here is training. What type of training internally do your folks that are involved in your facility ratings program? At the larger entities, it's multi-departments that are involved. Maybe at a smaller entity, not so much. So the training and the expectations and the controls for this, yes, it's scalable, right? We would expect a more robust and more mature process at your larger transmission owners who own the majority of the equipment as compared to the other folks. But the other folks, we still want to see what's scalable for the risk that you provide and what you should be doing as well. So I think what's your understanding there in training, and are you acclimating people on a regular basis, or are they just trained once and you assume they know it, and you just expect that your facility ratings are always going to be accurate moving forward in time? So if you want to go to the next slide. So really our goals here for today's Explain is for you to understand that your program, no matter how large or small you are on today's webinar, as a Quebec registered entity, that your program is paramount to reliability, and that's how we're going to consider it. So please take our advice, undertake a self-assessment, right? You're not going to know unless you check, right? So as Damase mentioned, I think as any of the non-compliances that do come into us, we're pretty much requiring a full extent of condition. That's the level of focus that is on the facility ratings standard right now. So you can do that in advance and do a self-assessment. And the idea with that is to increase the entity's awareness on how important this is, and B, we know there are issues out there. That's going to reduce the risk. The earlier that you can do the self-assessment, that's going to reduce the risk in an earlier time fashion. The mitigation is going to get started, and theoretically it's going to get completed in an earlier fashion when you do an earlier discovery on your own, instead of waiting for an audit for it to be discovered by NPCC staff. And then of course, discovery on your own, I think Damase mentioned it, is a credit when it comes into the enforcement realm where Damase works. And then always be flexible to adjust your process and controls, so that you have flexibility to adjust your process and controls, right? You want to take these actions that they're going to lead you to be sustainable, so that you remain compliant That's just the low bar compliant. We want you to be reliable and secure and resilient moving forward. So that's it kind of goes with it, right? Compliance is the low bar, reliability, security, sustainability, resilience. That's really the goal here, so that we're able to respond when things do happen because of the extra process and eyes that we have on this. So we're almost done. We'll just go over to our ultimate goal here is for either the entity to analyze it and find things, or for NPCC to engage the entity on an engagement. And if you're a TO or a GO, it's going to be on your engagement moving forward. We'll look to fix it, identify and prevent the errors to the extent that you can have preventative and detective controls. Those are the two most important ones to have. Corrective controls are important as well, but those happen after you already didn't prevent it and after you identified it. So the corrective ones are important, but that's number 3 on the totem pole. So, and let's work to sustain what we're actually going to prevent. Looking forward as the years to come, let's look to sustain that, right? We've got a changing electric grid coming here. Maybe not so much in Quebec, because you folks have a lot of renewables already on your system, but it's still going to be changing up there as well as all of northeastern North America. And this last slide, I'm just going to give you a few resources here. I won't really talk about them too much, but our friends down at CERC, down in Charlotte, North Carolina, they've got a really nice e-learning module on their site, and we will always raise our hand, and we'll always point to our regional partners when they have good stuff in education and learnings on their websites. There's the ERO practice guide, the link to that I mentioned about facility ratings, and then there's an ERO standards of application guide there, where that's put together by a group of stakeholders, for stakeholders on a good way to implement a particular standard. In this case, it's facility 8, FAC 8 facility ratings. So if you have any questions, your resources are reaching out to NPCC, and then I would just say your peers can help you too. There's a lot of you here on this call today, so find like-sized entities like yourselves with similar challenges and discuss things with them to see what controls and processes they have in their program to ensure their compliance and reliability and sustainability moving forward. So I'm going to stop there. I know I threw a lot at you. We're moving on to the last slide, so I can take any questions on anything NPCC in general, facility ratings, or anything that you may have in the chat.
Alors, tout d'abord, on a eu un commentaire de Mme Jeannette Gauthier. Je ne crois pas que ce soit une question. Alors, pour l'instant, il n'y a pas de question. Au besoin, si jamais c'est une question, on y répondra plus tard par voie de courriel. Mais il semble que ce soit seulement un commentaire. Alors, nous allons attendre encore une autre minute pour voir s'il y a des questions.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that in English. Can you read that to me again?
Okay, this is not a question. It's rather a comment or
okay.
a piece of information. And I said that if ever it would be a question, we would answer it later on via email.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I got a confirmation. It's not a question. Ce n'est pas une question. Merci.
Thank you, Jeannette.
Philippe, je propose d'attendre encore une minute et à midi, on va commencer la prochaine. On attend encore une minute pour les questions.
Très bien.
C'est midi, je ne vois pas d'autres questions. Merci beaucoup, Scott.
You are welcome.
Et maintenant, passons à la prochaine présentation. C'est Monsieur Michael Bilheimer. Qui va nous présenter les obligations.
Thank you, Lancia. And well, it's official. Good afternoon, everyone. So I believe I'm the last presentation of the day.
No,
and I'll
Michael,
be discussing critical infrastructure protection standards, SIP 002 and SIP 003. Oh.
Oui, il faut attendre la présentation. Obligation des entités visées relatives aux normes SIP 2 et SIP 3. Et on va attendre quelques secondes. Exactement. Merci.
Oh.
Michael, à toi.
Sorry about premature start there. So, good afternoon once again. I'm Michael Wilheimer, Senior SIP Analyst with NPCC. I'll be discussing the Critical Infrastructure Protection Standard SIP 002 and SIP 003 standard obligations. Next slide. First, the effective reliability standards for Quebec can be found on the Régie's website. Currently, the Régie is on version 5.1a of SIP 002, and this is not correct on the slide. It's on version 8 of SIP 003. When I wrote the slides, it was version 7, and then it just recently changed over. So just to add one more thing here, the Régie has a provisions specific to Quebec in Appendix QC section of the standards. This is a difference from the U.S. version of the standards. We don't have in the U.S. you don't have a Appendix QC. So make sure you check that before when reviewing the standards. Next slide. First, let's start off with SIP 2 applicability. The first difference you see is that the bulk electric system, or BES, is replaced by the terms main transmission system, or RTP, respectively for Quebec. The second major change is the exceptions. There's some extra exceptions specific to Quebec. They are generator owners whose nameplate capacity rating of 300 MVA or less, or facilities that can be synchronized with neighboring systems. And then the second part of that is step-up substations of the first set of exceptions. So you have some extra exceptions in the Quebec region that you have to account for in your SIP 2 methodology. These will also be applicable in the SIP 003-8. Next slide. So the first step of the process is to consider the listed facilities and apply attachment 1 of the impact ratings. The best way is to list all your assets generally and see if they fit one of these categories. Then apply the impact rating criteria. Remember to also apply the exception mentioned in the previous slide. So basically, NPCC will be looking for a list of all your assets, how you applied the criteria to them, and if they meet the criteria or if they did not meet the criteria. Next slide. In Appendix 1 of the standard, you will apply the impact criteria and place the assets in one of the 3 buckets, which are high, medium, and low. Once complete, this process must be completed once every 15 calendar months. Remember, high and medium assets require a list. Assets identified as a low do not require a list. However, it's best practice to keep a list updated for your low assets, just for you at minimum. You do not have to show the low impact list during the audit. However, it can provide additional evidence of a strong compliance program if you do decide to provide it. We can't make you, the standard doesn't require one, but having one makes a stronger program, and we appreciate it. It lets us know that you are looking at this. Next slide. Now we move into some controls here. Controls can be in the form of calendar reminders for smaller entities, generally. Larger entities can use it as well, but they're not as strong. As you get larger, it's harder to maintain a calendar reminder. Also, I suggest that calendar reminders be a group reminder and not just an individual calendar reminder. A task assignment system or government risk and compliance software, otherwise known as GRC tool. This software can have task escalation process in case a task is not completed in a desired time frame. Finally, you need to have a dated assessment of completion of requirement 1, which is the creation of the list. So, having those controls is very important to meeting compliance and making sure things get done. Next slide. Now we move into requirement 2. This is a much simpler part of the standard. What you must complete here is an annual 15-month review of part 1 and a SIP senior manager, which you delegate in SIP 003, which we will get into, or delegate approves of the requirement 1 list every 15 months. There are 2 additional things here. First, you must do an assessment and determine the list and sign off on the list. Even if the list has no applicable assets, you must create a blank list with no assets and have the designated SIP senior manager sign off on that list. This is referred to as a null list. Second, make sure to update the list if changes are identified and be able to explain why the changes were identified or made. In cases, this would be an additional removal. So, for example, if a special protection system is removed from the system and a substation is no longer applicable to the requirements. As a control, I would suggest setting the review at 12 months, and if it slips for some reason, and things happen, you will have an extra 3 months to complete the process. Next slide. Now we move into SIP 008. SIP 00. SIP 003-8. I know it says -7, but as I said earlier, it's now -8 up in the Quebec region. Requirement 1, 3, and 4 all revolve around the SIP senior manager. They are the SIP senior manager approval of the cybersecurity policies. Again, once every 15 calendar months. For requirement 3, the identification of the SIP senior manager within 30 days of a change in the position. Documentation of this change can be as simple as an email. For requirement 4, an entity must document delegations. This will have to be updated every time the SIP senior manager is changed. Now, he can keep the same delegates. He just needs to sign off on it and date it. Now I skipped requirement 2. Well, not yet. Go back one. Okay. So I skipped requirement 2. This is because it's different from all the rest. You can even say it's a standard within the standard. This is where the applicable compliance requirements are located for your low assets. We'll get into some of this in later slides. Okay, now next slide. Okay, these dates are for SIP compliance with SIP 003-7 version 7. So the new version, I believe, came into effect on October 1st. So this is not really applicable anymore. Next slide. So again, the same provisions and exceptions for Quebec that was present in SIP 2 are also present in SIP 3. So this is the same exact exceptions as the previous one. Next slide. So here are the various policies sections that must be present in the cybersecurity policies for high and medium assets. They are personnel in training, electronic security perimeters, which includes interactive remote access, physical security of the BES cyber system, system security management, incident reporting, response planning, recovery plans of the BES cyber system, configuration change management, and vulnerability assessments, information protection, and declaring and responding to SIP exceptional circumstances. So now we're going to, next slide, we're going to go into the lows. So you also need a cybersecurity for lows. If you have a high and medium cybersecurity policy, you can leverage that. If you don't have high and medium assets, you need to create one with these categories, which are cybersecurity awareness, physical security controls, electronic access controls, cybersecurity incident response, transient cyber assets, and removable media malicious code risk mitigation. And that's a mouthful. And then you have to have a section for declaring and responding to SIP exceptional circumstances. And again, these policies have to be signed off once every 15 calendar months. Next slide. Back to controls. Again, this can be as simple as a calendar reminder, or you can have a government risk and compliance software, again, to escalate and to remind people to do things. It would be a task reminder. So you should have an assignment of who does this, who owns the process, dated approvals of the actual security policy. Next slide. So this is going to be probably the bulk of the presentation here. This is the requirement 2 and attachment 1 and attachment 2 attachment 2. So we're going to start with awareness. So awareness material has to be distributed once every 15 calendar months. This can be direct communications like emails, memos, and computer-based training. Indirect communication, posters, intranet website, brochures, management support and reinforcement. Remember, this has to go to employees and contractors with access. And also, just a reminder, physical security counts for cybersecurity awareness. So this could be in the form of tailgating, locking gates, documenting broken physical security equipment, insider threat, and message about what to do with drones. All appropriate awareness. You have to apply it once every 15 calendar months. I would actually suggest that you do it on a more frequent basis. There's a lot of awareness material out there that you can have. Next slide. So now we're going to physical security controls. This can be as advanced as electronic bad readers, motion sensors, or cameras. However, it can be as simple as locked fences, walls, and locked doors, and human observation. This part of the standard gives entities a lot of latitude to decide what physical security controls will limit access to the identified lower facilities. Just remember, just document them. Next slide. Moving on to electronic security controls. Here you have to permit only necessary inbound and outbound electronic communications. This is different from high and medium assets. There are no ESPs. This is for all electronic access within the substation, with a few exceptions. So electronic inbound and outbound electronic communication, this would include corporate network, wireless network, SCADA information, dial-up connections, and so forth. To control access, you can use a firewall router, a switch with ACLs, host-based firewalls, data unidirectional gateway, I know that's a mouthful, to name a few. What is excluded is time-sensitive protection and control communications, like 61850 communications. I would note that the guideline and technical basis of the standard gives multiple designs and how to control inbound and outbound communications at low impact assets. I'm not going to go into detail because that could be a whole presentation of itself. Acceptable evidence includes diagrams, list of implemented routable communications, and dialogue controls. Next slide. Okay, now we go into the incident response plan. If you have a high or medium cyber incident response plan, you can leverage that. If not, your plan needs to have a list of components. In addition, entities need to test the plan once every 36 months, which is a long time to do. I would suggest, just for reliability purposes, you test the plan more often. Also, you need to update the plan within 180 days if you find updates are required. This could be an issue identified in a test, change in roles and responsibilities, or other changes. Make sure to document the date of the change was identified and when it was updated. Even though this is not a requirement, I would encourage you to share it with everyone associated with the plan and document that communication. That happens in the high and medium. It's not required here, but a plan that nobody knows how to use or find is not a great plan. It's once you distribute it to people and have them sign off on reading it, and then if you test it periodically, people know how to do it, and when you do have an incident, things happen that are never anticipated, or things don't work, and by knowing your plan, you can work around it and get through it. If you don't know your plan, you can get stuck. Next slide. Finally, for requirement 2, we have transient cyber assets and removable media, malicious code risk mitigation. TCAs responsible for one or more combination of methods to deter malicious code and activity. This could be antivirus scanning, whitelisting, things of that nature. Removable media, methods to detect malicious code, antivirus scanning it on the corporate network before plugging it into the protected network. And again, the methods we talk about: anti-malware software, whitelisting, hardening procedures, and there's other methods out there. Next slide. So now we get to the last two requirements. These are identifying the SIP senior manager and identifying delegating authority. This, again, you have to do it within 30 calendar days if you have a change in SIP senior manager. And then you have to sign off on a new delegation of authority. Remember, when somebody comes into the organization or leaves that was a delegate, you also need to update that delegation. That comes to the end of my presentation. My contact information is there if you want to contact me. And I'll take questions.
Thank you, Michael. Merci, Michael.
You know, it would help if I turn on the translator.
OK. Pour l'instant, je ne vois pas de questions. Nous allons attendre encore une minute.
Philippe, je pense qu'on a attendu.
Oui,
assez.
effectivement. Alors, on peut passer à l'autre présentation.
Merci beaucoup, Michael. Il n'y a pas de questions, c'était très clair. Merci beaucoup. On va passer maintenant à la dernière présentation du webinaire. Celle portant sur la politique relative au traitement d'une plainte alléguant une non-conformité à une norme de fiabilité du transport d'électricité du Québec. Il s'agit d'une nouvelle politique et de la version révisée de la politique relative à la surveillance et à l'application des normes de fiabilité du transport d'électricité du Québec. Prochaine diapo. Dans un premier temps, je vais vous présenter l'onglet dédié aux politiques à la section surveillance du site Internet de la Régie, pour ensuite passer en revue les faits saillants de la politique relative au traitement d'une plainte alléguant une non-conformité. En troisième point, je vais vous présenter les faits saillants de la version révisée de la politique relative à la surveillance pour passer à la période de questions. Eh bien, la Régie a voulu se doter d'un cadre pour le traitement des plaintes alléguant une non-conformité afin d'assurer la protection des plaignants ou des lanceurs d'alerte. En plus, il fallait également apporter des précisions dans la deuxième politique relative à la surveillance, quant à la transmission de la décision d'application aux parties prenantes du dossier d'application. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Bon. Étant donné qu'il reste encore quelques étapes administratives, les deux politiques ne sont pas encore affichées à la page, à la section surveillance du site Internet. Pour ceux qui sont déjà familiers avec le site Internet de la Régie, section surveillance, il y a un onglet dédié aux politiques relatives à la surveillance et à l'application des normes de fiabilité. C'est une question de temps, peut-être d'ici à la fin du mois ou dans le pire des cas, d'ici à la fin de l'année, les deux politiques seront affichées. Eh bien, vous allez être informés par l'entremise d'un quad neuf. Et je tiens à remercier ici tous ceux qui ont participé à l'écriture, à la rédaction et à la finalisation de ces deux politiques. Je sais qu'il y en a qui écoutent, alors je les remercie beaucoup. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Eh bien, Passons maintenant au point 2, les faits saillants de la politique relative au traitement d'une plante alléguant une non-conformité. Eh bien, cette politique traite les plantes alléguant une non-conformité à une norme de fiabilité déposée en vertu de l'article 3.8 du PSRQ. Cette politique-là ne couvre pas les plantes des consommateurs déposés à la Régie en vertu de l'article 7 de la loi. Il faut faire ces distinctions dès le début. Eh bien, on décrit dans cette politique les outils et les processus mis en place afin de traiter de façon confidentielle toute plainte. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. En ce qui a trait à la réception de la plainte, il va y avoir une mise à jour du formulaire de plainte. Il va être affiché en même temps que la politique relative au traitement d'une plainte alléguant une non-conformité. Eh bien, c'est nouveau parce que la Régie a créé une boîte courriel spécialement dédiée aux plaintes. Vous avez l'adresse à l'écran. Si jamais, occasionnellement, il y aura une plainte reçue, par exemple, à l'adresse secrétariat PSRQ, celle qu'on utilise d'habitude pour communiquer avec les entités visées, ou verbalement, par téléphone, soit au secrétaire adjointe, soit à toute autre personne de la Régie, eh bien, le plaignant est informé qu'il doit transmettre le formulaire à la boîte courriel spécialement dédiée aux plaintes. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Ensuite, en ce qui a trait à la réception de la plainte, eh bien, cette boîte courriel, plainte-PSRQ, a un accès restreint. L'adjointe de la Direction générale planification et réglementation a accès et consulte de façon régulière cette boîte courriel. Au moment de la réception d'une plainte, elle informe le secrétaire ou le secrétaire adjoint. Ce dernier verra à attribuer un numéro de référence à cette plainte et à déposer de façon sécuritaire le formulaire dans un dossier informatique dédié et où l'accès est restreint aux membres du comité d'évaluation de la plainte, parce que la Régie a mis en place un comité d'évaluation de la plainte. Quel est le rôle de ce comité? Eh bien, il confirme que la plainte est bel et bien liée au régime obligatoire de normes de fiabilité, sinon il recommande la fermeture du dossier. Dans le cas où la plainte n'est pas liée au régime obligatoire, elle est envoyée à l'autorité compétente à laquelle elle aurait dû être transmise. La Régie informe le plaignant de la transmission de la plainte à l'autorité compétente. Il se peut que le comité d'évaluation requiert des informations supplémentaires du plaignant par l'entremise du secrétaire ou du secrétaire adjoint. Au moment de sa publication, vous allez voir le formulaire de plainte. Il va y avoir une petite case où vous pouvez joindre, où le plaignant peut joindre des pièces justificatives le cas échéant. Malgré cela, si jamais des informations sont incomplètes, il est possible que la Régie ait besoin d'informations supplémentaires pour compléter son analyse en ce qui a trait aux faits allégués, et elle va le faire toujours par l'entremise du secrétaire ou du secrétaire adjoint. Le comité d'évaluation de la plainte va procéder au démarrage de l'enquête s'il y a assez de matière pour procéder et en informe le plaignant. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Pour ce qui est du démarrage de l'enquête, le plaignant est informé du démarrage à la demande de la Direction générale planification et réglementation. L'enquête peut être effectuée par le NPCC. En tout temps, l'identité du plaignant sera confidentielle et traitée comme telle. En ce qui a trait à l'étape des résultats de l'enquête, le plaignant est informé du résultat de l'enquête par l'entremise du secrétaire ou du secrétaire adjoint qui lui transmet le rapport du comité d'évaluation. Toute non-conformité décelée sera traitée conformément au PSRQ. Pour la fin de l'enquête, eh bien, les documents relatifs à la plainte seront traités selon les règles prévues au calendrier de conservation de la Régie. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Passons maintenant à la version révisée de la politique relative à la surveillance. Eh bien, nous l'avons mise en œuvre depuis à peu près plus de 4 ans. Eh bien, pourquoi c'était nécessaire? Parce que, en fait, la Régie exerce 3 types de fonctions et de pouvoirs. Les fonctions et pouvoirs de type réglementaire, quand elle fait l'adoption des normes de fiabilité. Fonctions et pouvoirs de type administratif, lorsqu'elle fait la surveillance de la conformité aux normes. Fonctions et pouvoirs de type quasi-judiciaire, quand elle impose des sanctions pécuniaires ou non pécuniaires en cas de contravention à une norme. En fait, dans le langage des avocats, afin d'éviter que le cumul des fonctions réglementaires, administratives et quasi-judiciaires ne porte atteinte au principe d'indépendance et d'impartialité de la Régie, cette dernière a adopté une approche de séparation fonctionnelle. En fait, on a dans la même bâtisse l'organisation qui fait la surveillance, un peu le policier, et l'imposition de sanctions pécuniaires, le juge. Donc, il fallait séparer la surveillance de l'imposition des sanctions pécuniaires. Il fallait séparer le policier du juge. Ça, c'est dans le langage de tous les jours. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Et oui. C'est un diagramme assez compliqué. Comment la Régie met en œuvre cette séparation fonctionnelle? C'est exactement ce que la politique explique et j'ai résumé la politique à l'aide de ce diagramme. J'attire votre attention pour encore quelques minutes. Eh bien, concentrons-nous sur le carré Régie de l'énergie. On a dit qu'elle exerce 3 types de fonctions et de pouvoirs. Quand elle fait l'adoption et mise en vigueur des normes à l'approbation du registre, elle exerce sa fonction et pouvoir de type réglementaire. Toujours dans le cadre du pouvoir réglementaire. Je vous prie de regarder la flèche vers la gauche. Eh bien, elle désigne le coordonnateur de la fiabilité. Le coordonnateur de la fiabilité qui dépose les normes de portée continentale rédigées par la NER ou qui dépose les normes de portée régionale rédigées par le NPCC, dépose ces normes-là à la Régie pour adoption et pour être mise en vigueur. Je reviens toujours au carré adoption et mise en vigueur des normes, approbation du registre. Il y a des régisseurs qui sont désignés au dossier réglementaire. On voit en bas un régisseur en bleu. Ce sont les régisseurs qui, normalement, siègent sur ces dossiers-là. Ensuite, passons à droite, toujours dans le carré Régie de l'énergie, quand elle fait la surveillance de la conformité aux normes. Eh bien, la Régie, dans son rôle de surveillante, je vous prie de regarder la flèche à droite. Surveille à l'aide du NPCC, qui les 31 entités visées. Le NPCC, par divers moyens, par divers processus de surveillance, comme par exemple audit, effectue avec la Régie la surveillance des 31 entités visées. Il y a un personnel attitré à la surveillance de la conformité aux normes à la Régie. C'est moi-même, mes collègues, M. Philippe Héroux, Roger Dufresne et notre stagiaire, M. Kewan Sanjari. Notre mission est de gérer les processus reliés à la surveillance de la fiabilité du réseau électrique au Québec. On est toujours dans la case surveillance de la conformité aux normes. Eh bien, il va y avoir quand même des décisions de surveillance qui doivent être rendues. Genre, au moment quand quand la Régie approuve le plan d'action ou quand la Régie approuve la recommandation du NPCC de traiter une non-conformité en ayant recours à la procédure simplifiée. Il va y avoir un régisseur spécial qui peut siéger dans les dossiers réglementaires, mais ce régisseur-là, qui est le président de la Régie, lui, il va rendre des décisions de surveillance. Donc, il fallait réserver un régisseur uniquement pour les décisions de surveillance. C'est la partie verte. Eh bien, on va passer maintenant à la partie rouge. Les zones encadrées en rouge, les carrés encadrés en rouge. Il se peut qu'il y ait un avis de non-conformité transmis par le NPCC à une entité visée. Dans la plupart des cas, le NPCC et l'entité commencent à entreprendre des discussions. à la suite de ces discussions-là, il pourrait y avoir une entente de règlement. Le NPCC va présenter cette entente de règlement, va recommander l'approbation de l'entente de règlement. Elle va faire cette recommandation à l'équipe surveillance de la conformité honor. La surveillance de la conformité honor va préparer la trousse ou le dossier de non-conformité qui va être transmis au bureau d'application. Le bureau d'application, quand il voit qu'il y a assez de matière pour procéder, il va demander à la régie l'ouverture d'un dossier de sanction ou dossier d'application. Eh bien, on continue avec la partie rouge. Au moment quand le dossier de sanction ou d'application est reçu par la régie, il va y avoir un régisseur qui va être nommé sur le dossier d'application. C'est au moment quand la régie exerce sa fonction et pouvoir de type quasi-judiciaire. Le régisseur qui est assigné au dossier d'application peut siéger sur les dossiers réglementaires, mais il ne siégera pas sur les dossiers de surveillance. Donc, il y a la séparation entre le président, toujours un régisseur, qui siège sur les dossiers de surveillance, et le régisseur en rouge, qui siège sur les dossiers d'application. Eh bien, qui est le personnel attitré à l'application des normes? C'est la formation, qui est désignée par le président, 1 ou 3 régisseurs, et sa mission est ainsi de rendre une décision d'application écrite et motivée. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on a fait dans ce diagramme-là et ce que la politique présente comme cadre qui a été mis en œuvre, c'est la séparation du vert par rapport au rouge. J'espère que cela a expliqué en grand comment la régie met en œuvre la séparation fonctionnelle. Et je vais prier Madame Sepulveda de passer à la prochaine diapo, l'avant-dernière. Eh bien, qu'est-ce qui est nouveau dans le cadre du processus décisionnel? Il va y avoir une décision d'application écrite et motivée, et rendue par la formation et déposée par le secrétariat dans le SDE application. Qu'est-ce qui est le SDE application? Eh bien, c'est un hyperlien dans le système de dépôt électronique où les dossiers d'application des normes sont créés. Ces dossiers sont accessibles uniquement par les parties prenantes au dossier d'application. Ensuite, une fois rendue, la décision d'application est déposée par le secrétariat dans un répertoire confidentiel auquel la direction chargée de la surveillance aura accès. La direction chargée de la surveillance dépose la décision d'application au système de surveillance de la conformité au Québec où le NPCC pourra en prendre connaissance. Donc, c'est cette clarification qu'on avait apportée dans la version révisée de cette politique quant à la transmission de la décision d'application. Ceci met fin à la présentation. On est rendu. Merci beaucoup de votre attention. On est rendu à la période de questions.
Alors, nous attendons vos questions. Nous allons attendre encore une minute.
Oui, en effet. Oui. Écoutez, je ne vois pas de questions. Comme il n'y a plus de questions, ceci met fin au webinaire Sensibilisation à la conformité. Je vous remercie de votre attention et je vous souhaite, au nom des organisateurs et des conférenciers, un agréable après-midi. Merci. Au revoir.